Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the show, Science Facts and Fallacies, episode 247. My name is Cameron English, your host as always. That's Dr. Liza Dunn, co-pilot, expert on all kinds of interesting topics. She's here to fill in the gaps where I don't know what I'm talking about. Liza, what's going on? How are you?
Fine. How are you? How's your weekend going?
It's magical. By the time everyone sees this, you will have had your Christmas. So we hope you had a great holiday season. Well wishes for the new year. And to start things off, I want to say I discovered something called the woozle effect on Twitter. I didn't know this was a thing. Did you know what this was?
No, I found it on Med Twitter.
Okay. So you can explain it because it sounds like a funny name. Everyone knows what it is though once you hear it. So can you explain that just really quick because it's kind of amusing.
Yes. Well, it's the what it is when a paper is cited multiple times for a claim that it actually doesn't make. So people make these citations. This paper said that glyphosate causes, cancer, and you actually then go read the paper, and the paper doesn't say that at all. And you see that over and over and over again in a lot of medical literature. So if people are just sort of repeating and regurgitating what other papers supposedly say without actually having read the paper. And where it comes from is a Winnie the Pooh story, right? And you want to tell that part.
Yeah. So if you've seen Winnie the Pooh, there's this mythical character called a woozle that they're always trying to chase down. I forget. They're either trying to find one or stay away from them, but there's heffalumps and woozles. And so
yes.
there was a team of social scientists in the 70s, the 80s, and they came up with this concept to explain this. Apparently that's like this mythical claim. It just it builds and builds and everyone believes it, but it's not true.
So Winnie the Pooh and Piglet start following their own footsteps back, and they think they're around and around and around because they think they're on the track of a woozle. So yes, it's hilarious.
Yeah. And it's because as soon as I saw the tweet, it came to mind a story I wrote where it was about glyphosate and endocrine disruption. And the scientists I interviewed for the story, they said this review that they cited to justify their paper says the exact opposite of what they claim it says. And so I looked at it, and sure enough, like in the abstract, glyphosate is not an endocrine disruptor. So I was like, this is so fascinating that this is all over the medical and the scientific literature.
That's exactly right. And the other thing that you can find is there's a study called Exaggerated, which is looking at all comers who are exposed to pesticides, all comers that work in agriculture in France. So bankers, lawyers, anybody that's got a connection to agriculture is part of this prospective cohort study. And the first section that they've looked at, or the first topic that they've covered, is cancer. So Agrican is what they've been looking at. And in the text, they make claims about pesticides being associated with cancer. And then you actually show the tables, and they make a claim that women who put pesticides on crops have a higher risk of melanoma and glioblastoma. And you actually look at their own data on the table, and it's not there. Where does this data come from? You're making it up.
Yeah, it's fascinating in its own right, and there's a reason we're bringing it up, though, as you'll see as we go through. And we're going to do just two stories this time because we want to spend a little more time on both, just sort of delving deep into some of the ideas because they're really important to discuss. So this first one is called, where's the headline? There it is. Following sensationalism, how media distorts science, including courts and regulators. And then we're going to talk about a specific example of the woozle effect, but then also some of these ideas in this first story. So this is by our good friend, Dr. Kevin Folta, originally writing for the Genetic Literacy Project. It's called Glyphosate Can Harm Pregnant Women Living Near Farms? ? I never know how to say a question out loud with ? Carelessly written article based on the same author's academic study shows how misinformation metastasizes. Okay, so this first piece we're going to talk about, this is by Richard Williams and Nathan Schottman, And Richard Williams, I want to say, used to be at the FDA. He was some sort of regulator at the FDA. I don't recall exactly. And then Nathan Schottman is a lawyer, and his specialty, I believe, is what are they called? Product liability, that kind of stuff. You know, like if there's claims that a company makes a product that is harmful, that's the sort of area of the law that he works in. But here they're just talking about how science is abused in the courtroom. This is really well-worn territory for us. But the problem seems to be, at least according to them, is that you have you have bad studies that come out, and then you have media, you know, CNN, AP, Reuters, and so forth. They cover this research, and then you have environmental groups or activist groups. They either do their own research in quotes, or they just take really low quality studies and they amplify them, and then everyone finds out about them. And then this becomes the fuel for lawsuits. And it's not coincidental that a lot of these groups have relationships with law firms, or they get donations from law firms, you know. So it's this nasty, vicious, rotten circle where there's a lot of people getting rich by lying to the public.
And if you look at a good person to follow on Twitter to get into more detail about this is David Zaruk, the risk monger. He's got a blog called The Fire Break, which really gets into great detail. So I would encourage anybody who's interested in this to actually go follow him and read his blogs on this.
It's very good. He just did a 2-part series on a specific study on glyphosate. I want to say it's called Trouble in the Heartland or Corruption in the Heartland or something. But it's about this institute that was set up to do glyphosate studies. It was set up by lawyers and by people who were paid by the organic food industry. So it was set up. It's a whole nother story. We'll talk about it sometime. But yeah, David Zaruk, excellent follow, because he does the journalism that journalists don't do.
That's right.
He sent them stories. He says, "Here, look at all this stuff," and they won't do it. So he does it.
Yeah.
In any case, that's sort of the issue that they're dealing with in this DC Journal piece. And their solution ultimately is to say we need ripe science. So I guess apparently, I didn't know this, but in legal circles, there's this concept of ripeness. So like a case is ripe when you can make it based on legitimate evidence, or there's a strong legal standing for an argument. I think that's what it means. But they say that we need something similar for science. So lawyers shouldn't go into the courtroom with underdeveloped hypotheses or, you know, just preliminary studies that shouldn't be used to justify litigation.
Exactly.
So the idea, I don't know how this is supposed to happen, Liza. Maybe you can speak to that. I mean, there are supposedly checks and balances in place. Like the most well-known one is the Daubert standard, where you're supposed to have a judge say this expert is qualified to be a witness in this case, or this one's not. But that does not work nearly as well as it should, because you have baby powder lawsuits and pesticide lawsuits and breast implant lawsuits, and you know what I mean? Billions and billions of dollars have been paid out in these junk, tort cases. So I mean, it's great information they have here. I just don't know how we get that actually implemented in a courtroom.
So yeah, I think it's going to be really important for anybody who's innovative and starts a company to think about the implications of tort reform. Tort is really, unfortunately, dragging down a lot of companies. Now, if companies do something wrong, then absolutely. But if you have science-free claims that are actually bankrupting companies and depriving consumers of very valuable products, and products, especially if they're really, really foundational to the stability of your, for example, agricultural system, that is a problem. So, like I've said before, glyphosate is agriculture is the foundation of civilization, and glyphosate is probably the most important chemistry in the world. And it's off patent. It's cheap. It's got a very, very low toxicity. And it is not a carcinogen. And the fear that's been generated by people who have the goal of making a company go bankrupt is problematic. especially because, it makes you lose global agriculture. We saw what happened in Sri Lanka when they banned glyphosate in the first place. So they banned glyphosate in a science-free claim that it caused kidney disease. And once again, these have all been really very closely analyzed and studied by regulatory agencies all over the world, independent scientists all over the world. There's animal data, there's laboratory data, there's epi data that's very robust, that shows that there's no association between glyphosate and cancer, no association between glyphosate and neurotoxicity, no association between glyphosate and kidney disease. But because of these claims, people make policy decisions. And those policy decisions are often not well thought out. And if they're done because of public pressure rather than because a regulatory body has looked at things very carefully and looked at the scientific data and weighed the evidence, you can have some pretty severe consequences. So for Sri Lanka in 2015, they banned glyphosate because of this claim. Tea is one of their major exports, and tea exports pay for 71% of their food imports, according to the Food and Agricultural Organization. So their food security is dependent on that crop. That's a cash crop for them. When you think about that island, it's a tropical island, and so the jungle grows very rapidly. And so you have the jungle coming into the island or into the tea plantations, and now you have young Tamil women hand weeding the jungle. And what's in the jungle? Snakes, and not wussy snakes like we have in the United States, copperheads, rattlesnakes. We have about 12 snake bite deaths a year in the United States. These are kraits and cobras and snakes that are deadly. And workers were refusing to go into the plantations. There are newspaper articles describing people's fear of being bitten by snakes. And in 2017, the World Health Organization classified snakebite as one of the leading neglected causes of morbidity and mortality in the developing world, largely affecting agricultural workers. So because of the fear around this, they had not only a huge economic impact, negative impact on the country, and it rattled food security, but you also have a real health trade-off that's you're talking about virtually, it's such a low toxicity chemical versus cobra bite. That's a pretty dramatic difference. And so it had such a negative impact on the economy that they wound up reinstating glyphosate in 2018. And then because of public pressure once again and misguided information, they decided to just double down and ban all agrochemicals and fertilizer, with the resulting effect that the whole economy collapsed. They can't get energy, they can't get food, they can't get healthcare. Everything collapsed. And in July, so they banned it in April of 2021. By July of 2022, there was essentially a rebellion. The whole country overran the president's office. He had to flee, and the economy is still in shambles because of this. Now, some people say, well, there are other things besides agriculture that are important, tourism and all of this stuff. There are other destabilizing factors, corruption. Well, multiple countries have corruption. They survived they didn't collapse during a 27-year civil war. They didn't collapse during after the tsunami. So this is a cautionary tale in how important it is that you have good agricultural policy that's based on science rather than hype and fear mongering that's generated by people who have ulterior motives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very good points. It's always important to remember, because I sometimes think about it, like I get in fights with evil people on Twitter, like Carrie Gilliam. and I sometimes I'm like, why am I doing, is it worth insulting her? I'm like, yeah, it is, because she's awful. And this is what happens, because you have people like her who pose as journalists, or they pose as activists, they're fighting the man. And then you have news outlets like The Guardian, which aren't news outlets. They're pay-for-play writers, basically, because they take money from foundations that have specific political agendas, and then they publish stories that boost those agendas. That's all they do. And as Liza's saying, this kills people, it's awful, right? I mean, I couldn't imagine like going into my office where I work and be like, oh, there's a snake that might kill me, right? Like that doesn't even occur to me because
Exactly.
like, my world is so far removed from that. But that's the reality for a lot of these people. And then you have these Western wealthy progressive activists who say, I'm sticking up for these people on the other side of the world, and down with Monsanto. It's
and they've captured the imagination of academics who don't have enough of a background to understand what the realities are of agriculture. Remember, 2% of the population farms, but you've got ivory tower academics, and I used to be an ivory tower academic, so I understand where they were and where they are. And so I'm not saying that those folks are poorly intended, or the academics often aren't. The academics are often captured because they read these little snippets and they believe what they read. And so, but that is, I mean, Stalin had a word for that. That's useful idiocy, right? So, and so I'm not trying to, they think they're doing the right thing, but the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Yeah. Yeah. Liza's not trying to be mean. I am. I think if you, because I don't have to get grants and I don't have to work with these people, so I can tell you this is what you're doing is awful. The one thing I will say, to be fair though, is that you get into an echo chamber, and everyone can be, a victim of that. But in the academic space, Thomas Sowell, the economist, talks about this in Intellectuals in Society, and he says you have all these big brain people that hang out with other big brain people. They work in laboratories, or they're academics. They do academics, and they all agree with each other, right? So like you get your work reviewed by someone who shares all of your values and all of your assumptions, and they stamp it and they go, "Good job, Steve. Thanks, Bob. Yeah, aren't we smart?" And then all the while, there's the real world out there, and what they think does not comport with the real world. But instead of going, maybe I need to, rethink my assumptions here, it's like, oh, wow, we just need to do more of this thing that we already know is right, because everyone I talk to knows that this is right, So in other words, there's an important check on how people behave and what they think out here in reality, which is whether an idea works or not, So if an entrepreneur has an idea and it fails, he knows it failed because he didn't make any money in his company. You know what I mean? But that's gone. You don't have that mechanism in the academy.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And what you get is you actually get regulation because of this kind of stuff and this kind of pressure. You get regulation by litigation or regulation by legislation, rather than using a scientific process and having trust in the regulatory agencies that have brought us a lifestyle that is unrivaled compared to previous centuries. Romanticizing subsistence farming that's not a smart idea. And I have photographs. I've posted them on Twitter of people hand weeding the jungle. So I think that it's really important to think critically about the claims we think are correct.
Yeah. It's very important. And we have a real life example of this, as I mentioned. So I'm not just like throwing mud at people because I like to. I do like to, but we have really good evidence for this in this case. So this is a story by Dr. Kevin Folta, who was Dr. Liza's predecessor here on the podcast. And he's writing this story for Genetic Literacy Project. And he's talking about it's called a research brief. So it was a peer-reviewed article. It was originally published in July in a journal called Environmental Health Perspectives, which is widely known within our science circle of trust as this phony journal where you just publish nonsense about chemicals. At least that's what I think about.
That's right.
So I won't speak for anyone else. I got to be careful here, but it's just largely a journal where, if you want a study that says that PFAS are going to kill people, that's where you go to find that kind of stuff. Anyway, so there was a study, they looked at 22 pregnant women, and they measured the amount of glyphosate in their urine. And then 60% or 66% of these women had detectable amounts of glyphosate in their urine. And then our good friend Carrie Gillum, who I was just singing praises of, She coordinated several articles from different outlets that she works with. So there was The Guardian, there was the Environmental Working Group, and then there was an article in this outlet called The Conversation, which really should know better because their whole mission is to bring science down to average people, right? It's to get academics in front of the public and explain complicated science. And in this case, they're using that model, which is excellent, to lie to people, which is really bad. And the big problem that Kevin highlights in this story is that it was two of the authors of this peer-reviewed paper writing for The Conversation. And so their academic article was much more measured. It was much more cautious in what they were saying. But they threw off all those restraints. So when they're writing for The Conversation, they're throwing around words like harm very liberally, and they're talking about there's no consensus on glyphosate safety, which is so preposterous at this point in time.
Patently false.
Yeah.
Patently false.
Yeah. And again, we've talked about it over. Kevin says it's 50 years of research, thousands of studies, different study designs, different parts of the world, different research teams, industry, non-industry. It doesn't matter. There's nothing. There's no there. It just I don't know what to tell you, right? It's, but they take this very limited data and they imply that there's a threat here, and there's not. And we'll get into some of the specifics. Kevin does a great job of breaking down the technical science here and explaining it to people. So let's get into the results. Why don't you start with why finding a little bit of a chemical, and we're talking like trace amounts, like tiny little amounts of a chemical in your urine or in somewhere in your environment is not necessarily evidence that you're in danger.
So one of the foundational principles of toxicology is that the dose makes the poison. And we know that trace doses in parts per trillion. So you're talking about a 1 drop in a 10,000 gallon swimming pool, right? If you actually think about it, if you think about the principles of homeopathy, which a lot of people buy into, right? They say that a trace amount of a poison that gets diluted over and over and over and over again will confer protection against said chemical. So that's a whole principle behind homeopathy, right? And I don't believe in homeopathy, but I believe that if you dilute something incredibly much, you are not going to have a poor outcome. So the dose makes a poison. Parts per trillion of glyphosate is not harmful at all. It does not bioaccumulate. It does not cause problems with gestation or babies or anything like that. It's not neurotoxic. It's not a carcinogen. It's not going to hurt you, and it's a cornerstone of our agriculture. And so when people are making these claims that a very, very tiny trace amount is resulting in things like cancer or autism or neurodevelopmental issues or changes in pregnancy length, that's all a speculation. There's absolutely nothing to support that claim other than their own ideology. And it's destructive. It's really destructive. And I can't emphasize this enough. I mean, if you think about it, so one of the claims that they make is that pregnancy length is shortened. And if you look at the length that is shortened by, it's like 1 or 2 days, right? And if an obstetrician could predict when a baby was due within days, like within that close of a rigid of a time frame, people would be able to schedule everything around their due date, right? But we know that there's like a 2-week window somewhere where the woman got pregnant, so where fertilization occurred. We don't know exactly the right day unless you're actually keeping very close track of your fertility. So there's a couple of days of wiggle room or 2 weeks of wiggle room around the front end. And then, anywhere from 37 weeks to 40 weeks is, considered normal. And then people go a little bit early sometimes, 36 weeks. Babies usually do fine. you don't tend to get into any kind of trouble at 36 weeks, and you don't tend to get into much trouble except for the baby being heavier at 42 weeks. So you've got a big, huge range there. So making the claim that shortening gestation by a day or two is a solid way of measuring, fetal harm is beyond the pale. It's just not factually true, and they're making claims like that, and it scares people to death.
Yeah.
What should scare people to death is the fact that this is propaganda. This is what that is. It's propaganda, and it will, if you romanticize getting rid of all of pesticides, you are going to wind up being back in the Middle Ages and seeing diseases of the Middle Ages and food insecurity, and it's very retrogressive.
Yeah. This annoys me to no end, because my wife's pregnant right now with our daughter, and like the range of emotions you experience, especially for the woman, right, carrying the child, the fears you have, the uncertainty around, is our baby going to be healthy? Am I eating right? Am I exercising too much? Am I exercising too little? Am I sleeping enough? And like, this is all constantly circling around in your mind. And to have people, qualified scientists and major reputable outlets like The Conversation, to have these people pushing this for ideological reasons, because they don't like corporations, or they don't like capitalism, or like chemicals, are just inherently bad in their worldview. That's shameful. That's shameful, because there are real threats out there. There are real things that pregnant women need to be worried about. And for you to use your platform and your expertise to inject bullshit into this environment, excuse my language, I'm sorry, that's just over the line.
It's disgraceful.
Yeah.
It's disgraceful, and it's tragic, because what it does is we're in an inflationary period right now. We are spending hundreds of millions of dollars investigating a chemical that has been so well understood. It's probably the best understood chemistry on the planet. And it gets repeatedly studied at taxpayer expense, at independent agencies' expenses, and the results are consistently clear. And so the question is, how much more evidence can we provide, and what will help reassure people that this is it's okay? I mean, what's fascinating to me is a lot of the same people who think that organic food, and I don't have a huge problem with organic food. There's not a lot of, but they use pesticides too. They're more expensive. It can't realistically feed a growing population. But a lot of people who are religious about eating organic food have no qualms about putting the most potent neurotoxin known to mankind, injecting it in their faces for cosmetic purposes. Botulinum toxin will kill people unless you use it, and we don't have any problems using it for beauty, because the dose that we use is going to be safe if you use it according to the label. Right? People get hung up with, oh, what if I don't use it according to the label? If you don't use it according to the label, you can hurt yourself. But on the whole realm of things, nanograms of botulinum toxin can be lethal. And I was involved with a case. I don't know if I've said this on a previous podcast, but I was involved with a case where a doctor who had a beauty clinic had a Botox party in Florida. With two friends and his girlfriend. And he decided to save money by buying research-grade botulinum toxin. And it said on the vial, not for human use, right? And he had a Botox party and gave a 17,000-fold dosing error. And then they flew to New Jersey for Thanksgiving. And they both presented to the ER with a rapidly descending paralysis. She was in the ICU, and she could only wiggle one toe in the ICU from November until May with a tracheostomy, so that, the hole in people's necks that smokers used to have. But sometimes if you need that, if you're going to be intubated for a long time, on a ventilator for a long time, and a G tube for feeding. From November to, imagine that hospital bill, right? So this can be lethal, but because you can trust the regulatory agencies around this and the regulatory science around this product, there are also some really good things that come from it. You can use it therapeutically for other things besides just beauty, but we perceive this as okay. And so now you take another chemistry that is, once again, nowhere near the same toxicity profile, and their people are incredibly fearful of it, and it's really unfortunate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Kevin talks about this in the story a little bit. There are some really low quality studies, kind of like this one. They don't reproduce good results. They just do the same dumb study. So they take 15 or 20 women who live in a town where there is agriculture, like in the Central Valley in California. And they say, well, you live in a place where the average application rate of this pesticide is such and such, and you have a slightly elevated rate of some stupid variable like gestation period, or circumference of your baby's head, or autism, or like they always find something, and they go, well, you have a 27% increased risk, without reporting the absolute risk or giving people context to understand what that means.
Exactly.
And then we get this. Then we get conversation stories like this. And then we have to come on here and go, well, pump the brakes. Let's talk about the details. And what's funny to me is that if these claims were true, because as they are wont to point out, there are millions and millions of pounds of glyphosate applied to farms every year, right? That's true. But if that were a problem, you would see it everywhere, because there's babies born everywhere. Everybody eats food. There are trace amounts of glyphosate in a lot of the food that you have access to, very small quantities. If this was a threat, it would it would be something akin to smoking, I think. And correct me if that's wrong.
That's right.
If a mother smokes during pregnancy, you will see the effects almost certainly in her child. And if glyphosate was harmful in a measurable, serious way, you would see it and you go, oh, she was exposed to too many pesticides. But you don't see that because there is no risk.
That's exactly right. The other thing is, yes, I mean, because these are such small doses. These are non-toxic doses. It's non-toxic doses. They're so low. But you will see the same pediatricians, and I once again, I'm not trying to. I think pediatricians are well intended. They don't know the agriculture literature. They don't know the epidemiology or the toxicology behind this. They hear pesticides. They get very concerned, and so you'll see pediatricians who are well intended who will say, absolutely not. Vaccines don't cause autism. How could you make that association? But the same crowd will say, well, yeah, there's a lot of autism around, but and so we think it's an environmental exposure like pesticides. But these are associations. They're not causative, and there's not a mechanistic way for this to be happening. And so, like I said, I think that a lot of people, a lot of academics, a lot of pediatricians want to do the right thing by their patients, want to do the right thing and be correct, but they don't know the literature in depth enough to be able to support these claims. And the problem is that this is not just like, baby powder. This is a chemical that is foundational to food security. Right. And I think if they understood that might give them a little bit more pause.
One other thing that we can talk about a little bit, it relates to the dose makes the poison thing. But Kevin points out that they've reported a range of values. So there was this much glyphosate to this much glyphosate in this sample of urine. But Kevin points out they didn't report what's called a limit of quantitation.
Quantification. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And I guess the idea is you're supposed to, it's like a confidence interval, right? You're supposed to say, I can say with this amount of certainty that the range is in here, but they didn't report that. So you don't really know like how much was there? Can you talk about
how much
that?
was there? Yeah. So just because you detect, so there's some there for laboratories to be able to have a validated assay for measuring things, you want to make sure that when you measure something repeatedly, you're getting a good number, right? You're getting the correct report. And so there are levels of detection, and then there are levels of quantification. And laboratories will say, so just because you detect a trace amount of something there, you're not actually able to say exactly how much is there, right? And so the level of quantification is one of the standard validation tools that tests use, and you'll see over and over in this kind of literature. It helps you tease out if something's a false positive, right? It makes it more reliable and reproducible. And without that metric, and it's a little bit technically complicated, but without that metric, you can't really make a claim that you are getting a consistent levels. You just a trace detection one has no implications on whether or not about the validity of the actual assay, and a trace detection has no reliable no health outcome. There's not a health implication from that. So these like I said, these are non-toxic doses. And once again, back to our Ames study that we like to quote all the time. Bruce Ames wrote a study, I want to say in 1991, and 99% of the pesticides you eat or are exposed to are chemistries that plants make to protect themselves because they can't run away from you. And those traces are in orders of magnitude higher than any trace pesticide you'll find on your produce, right? And so think about it. Apple seeds and peach pits and things like that have cyanogenic compounds in it. If you eat enough of those, they'll turn into cyanide. And you can have cyanide poisoning. And the reason why they're like seed coatings for their own seeds. They're like Mother Nature seed coatings, right?
Right.
And so it's protecting itself because their instinct is the survival of the fittest, right? And so you will find doses of those chemistries in much higher concentrations than you will for the chemistries that are applied to plants and for crop protection. And we would never tell people not to eat fruits and vegetables because you have higher concentrations of chemicals that could be toxic in a high enough dose.
Yeah. Scientific American will do that, incidentally.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's striking when you think about it. Like why would a tobacco plant produce nicotine?
Right. Exactly.
And why would caffeine be found in nature, right? Like we enjoy it because it's like, oh, it's a little stimulant, or if you use tobacco or whatever, you get a little buzz from it and you enjoy it or whatever. But the plant doesn't, right? The plant, like the tobacco plant's like, well, I really need a Marlboro, right? Like that's just, it's
the plant's like, I don't want a bug to eat me.
Right. Right. So it serves a purpose. It appears in nature for a reason. And
that's exactly right. Well, I mean, yes, it is fascinating. That's exactly right. And we actually make our very own pesticide in our own skin. Vitamin D. So the same vitamin D that is made in our skin when the sunlight hits our skin is used as a rodenticide for rats. So, I mean, we've got, in fact, a lot of people are vitamin D deficient, and you supplement with vitamin D. So, yeah, it's the notion that that there's some kind of mystery to the dose makes a poison is a little bit unfortunate. There's Buster.
Yeah. Our dogs are passionate about pesticides as well. They get really frustrated by Carrie Gilliam and the Guardian, so they bark all the time. All right, well let's end there, and we've only talked about 2 stories, and we just went nuts because we're so passionate about this stuff. But we'll stop there. Thank you for joining us as always. We'll be back next time for 248, In the meantime, follow us on Twitter. It's at Dr. Liza MD, at CamJ English, at Genetic Literacy for GLP, because they put this on for us, make it all possible. So follow them, read their content. Thank you so much. See you next time.
Thank you. Have a good week and happy holidays.
Yes. Happy New Year.